Hello, hello, and welcome. Today, what I want to do is to discuss a matter having to do with the elements practices found in early Buddhism, the 4, 5, or 6 elements practices. I got a question recently over on Patreon from one of my patrons over there, and thank you to all my patrons over on Patreon. My patron, Robert Kunch, who asks about, and I hope I pronounced the name right, Kunch, who asks about this element practice. What is it like? How do you do it? And the more that I got into researching this, the more I realized that the elements practice is really quite vast. There's a lot of information there. And so what I'm going to be doing is doing a number of different videos about the elements practice. And before I get to those, though, I wanted to do a historical introduction to this whole idea of the elements. Because oftentimes when I hear discussions of the elements within early Buddhism or within these practices, they don't seem to me necessarily very well informed about the elements in general. And so this video will be something of a historical introduction, some sort of a comparative research of the elements in the classical times, that is to say the times around the Buddha, but in different parts of the world, looking at similarities here. Now, just to be clear, in early Buddhism there are a number of different elements practices. Now, the most common involves the 4 elements, earth, water, fire, and air. But there are also some that mention 5 elements, which adds space as the 5th element. And there's still others that involve 6 elements that add space and consciousness. So, when we're asking about the elements in Buddhism, it's something of a question about how many we're really talking about. In these videos, I'm really going to be sticking mostly to the 4 elements practices because those are the most common and the most easy, I think, to understand. They're the most fully described. And so we'll stick to the 4 elements in these videos. Now to something of the historical background. This idea of there being 4 or perhaps 5 elements is, we might say, a common heritage of a lot of Indo-European cultures. 4 elements being earth, water, fire, air, or maybe earth, water, fire, air, and the void, or some fifth thing involving space. Again, this is something that we find in many different cultures around the world, generally in an Indo-European setting. And this began, indeed, so far as we know, it's not clear exactly how far back it goes. It goes back to the pre-Socratic philosophers in Greece, which is really quite a long time ago. 6th to the 7th century BCE, Thales is famous for having believed that everything was made of water. So he talked about that one of these elements was primary, in particular that water was primary, and so everything was, in a sense, made of water. On the contrary, Anaximenes, who was a 6th century pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, believed that everything was made of air. So there was clearly a certain amount of debate within ancient Greece, classical Greek philosophy, in particular, not classical, but pre-classical, or we might say pre-Socratic Greek philosophy, about which one of these different elements was primary, and what stuff made up all of physical reality. Now, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, and he lived in the 4th century BCE, and he mentions a Greek philosopher named Empedocles, who lived a century before him, more or less around the same time as the Buddha, a little earlier than the Buddha, so far as we know. Empedocles, Aristotle says, was the first person to claim that there were 4, and we might say 4 and only 4 of these elements. Now, this doesn't mean that Empedocles invented the idea of there being elements, or had the idea that there were earth, air, fire, and water were important. That clearly, as we've already seen, goes back to a period well before him. But he seems to have been the first within at least the Greek tradition to believe that there were sort of 4 and only 4, and that that it wasn't that one of these was primary and the other ones were secondary, but that these were all four equally important. So within the Greek tradition, that's what we find. Now, Empedocles himself associated each of these different elements with a different god. So, for example, Earth was the domain of Hades. Hades is the god of the underworld, so he would have been related to Earth. And then air was, I believe, Hera. Zeus was fire, Zeus being the chief of the gods, so you expect him to be associated with fire, although there also, I believe, was a god of fire in Greece, I believe. But in any event, he associated Zeus, the chief of the gods, with fire, and Nestus was the god who associated with water. So these were sort of, not only were they elements, but they also had a kind of a divine importance. However, it wasn't until Plato that these four gained the names elements within the Greek tradition. Now, Plato, some of us will know, was Aristotle's teacher, and indeed Plato himself was taught by Socrates. So Plato was sort of at the nexus here of the real invention of the classical era of Greek philosophy. And Plato believed that each of these four elements was important because each one was associated with a particular regular polygonal solid. So, for example, the reason that Earth was very stable was that the particles of Earth were cubes, and cubes are naturally stable. They don't tend to move around a lot. On the other hand, Plato believed that the elements of fire were made up of small pyramids, because pyramids are sharp and cutting and can pierce things the way fire can. And he also believed that the fifth element, which is, again, one we won't be discussing a whole lot, but that the fifth element was a dodecahedron, but it was a very, very large dodecahedron. In fact, it encompassed the whole visible universe. And indeed, it was the object on which the constellations, the stars, were hung. So they were, this dodecahedron, which was this fifth element, was indeed the night sky that we would see, or the day sky as well, but certainly the night sky that we could see the constellations on. Now, there were also similar ideas of there being things like the elements in other non-Indo-European cultures, such as in China or in Persia. In China, what we have are what are sometimes translated as the 5 phases or 5 processes of fire, water, wood, metal, and earth, which were believed to sort of intermix and intermingle over time as one transformed into the other, in a sort of a similar way that we find Buddhism sort of believing that things don't remain as such for any period of time, they're always changing. But in any event, these were sort of similar but slightly different ideas than the ones we found in ancient Greece and we find in early Buddhism, but related. And some say as well that you can find ideas of the 4 elements in the Vedas, which are these early Indian texts, the earliest religious texts we find in India. I haven't been able to locate them in the Vedas. However, if you know where they are in the Vedas, I'd be interested to know. However, the basic idea here is that the idea of there being 4 elements, or perhaps 5 if we include space, is pre-Buddhist. It goes back to a time before the Buddha's lifetime, and indeed was part of the sort of general cultural heritage into which we believe the Buddha was born. Now, the dates of the Buddha's lifetime are somewhat contested, but my understanding is that most scholars now tend to cluster around a belief that he was probably born around 480 BCE, that is to say in the early 5th century BCE, and that he died around 400 BCE. And these dates are roughly similar to those of Empedocles that we've seen, was the Greek philosopher who was the first to believe that there were 4 and only 4 elements, and that sort of all things are made of those 4. The basic idea here, though, is that in the ancient world we have this notion floating around. We find, again, in ancient Greece, even in China, sort of similar ideas that the world, the visible world, the physical world we see around us, is to one extent or another made up of a small group of elements, 4, 5, 6, something like that. And that when we therefore see a physical object, we can try to, at least mentally, conceptually, take it apart into its individual elemental parts. To an extent, we can do that. And Buddhism, early Buddhism, the Buddha himself, seems to have adopted this and come up with this idea. It was not the Buddha's invention. However, the Buddha's take was nothing like Plato's. The Buddha did not have an atomistic idea, certainly did not believe that the elements were constituted by particular shapes or anything like that. We don't find any of that kind of discussion in early Buddhism. The Buddha wasn't really interested in these kinds of what you might call physical or physics kinds of discoveries. What the Buddha was most interested in was ending dukkha, ending suffering, and so his understanding of the elements as constituting physical objects was all sort of part of a philosophy that was intended to engage our practice rather than one that was simply conceptual or theoretical in its intentions, the way it was for Plato, for example. Nowadays, many of us think of this idea of there being 4 or 5 or 6 elements is essentially pre-scientific. That is to say, it stems from a culture that was in existence before the development of modern sciences, and that nowadays that conception has been replaced by a chemical conception of what elements are, where nowadays we believe that there are, at last count, 118 elements that are themselves made up, each of those is made up of smaller parts, smaller atomic elements, or parts within the elements that make up the elements that they are. So the right number of neutrons and protons and so on, electrons, makes an element what it is, and that element can be deconstructed into a smaller groups of protons, neutrons, electrons, and so on. So that's the kind of view that we have nowadays. Now, some Buddhist apologists will say that in fact the idea of there being only 4 elements, earth, water, fire, and air, comes from an idea of the 4 phases of matter. This is a scientific idea that matter can be seen as solids, as liquids, as gas, or as a plasma. And these are the 4 ways that we can find matter around us in the universe. And so the idea is that perhaps the Buddha was sort of a proto-scientist, aware of this distinction of the 4 phases of matter, and that's why he sort of came up with the 4 elements. Now this is to my mind, a sort of a creative response, but it's not really one that we can take terribly seriously. To begin with, as we've already seen, this idea of there being 4 elements is not an invention of the Buddha himself. This was something that was in the air of the ancient world, classical world in general. It goes back to centuries before the Buddha's lifetime. It was not his discovery. And second, in the ancient world, the idea was that all physical things were an intermixture of these elements. So we didn't find an element absolutely purely anywhere particularly. Anything that we would see around us was kind of a mix of earth, air, fire, and water in different degrees and ratios. For example, in one early sutta, we read about how somebody who is a particularly good meditator can understand and see the way in which a tree trunk is made up of earth, water, fire, and air. That earth, water, fire, and air are all in that tree trunk at the same time. That's when we see a tree trunk, we're seeing a conglomeration of earth, water, fire, and air. However, there's no good sense in which a tree trunk contains plasma. Indeed, there's no good sense in which a tree trunk contains fire either, so long as it's not burning. So the reality here is something a little bit more practical, shall we say. We're not talking about modern chemistry, we're not talking about the 4 phases of matter. What we're talking about really, when we're talking about the 4 essential elements in early Buddhism is a matter of practice, of how we experience the world, our phenomenological experience of the world, of physical objects. And if we see it in practical terms, in practice terms, then I think this idea of there being four elements makes a lot of sense. Because in our experience, we do experience the world as solids, as liquids, as gases or air, wind, and as warmth and cold, which is really what we're really discussing when we're talking about fire. We're talking about warmth and cold, different kinds of temperatures, which is an essential part of how we experience physical reality. So I think when we're looking at the history of these elements, we have to be careful to say that they come from a sort of a pre-scientific or proto-scientific understanding of the natural world, but within a Buddhist context, I think they are most skillfully seen and understood as a practical kind of way we experience the world. And my next video will be on one of the parts of this four elements practice, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen when it's ready. Meanwhile, I hope you will join me over on Patreon if you're getting something out of these videos, and help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.